Okay, well, sorry we're starting a few minutes late. Apologies for the delay. Thank you everyone for being here. So we're here as the Coalition for University Accountability. So we're really excited about this legislation, a couple pieces of legislation that are being introduced to finally hold our universities accountable for a lot of the exploitation that some of our biggest nonprofit institutions have caused. We have some excellent legislators here, as well as some community organizers and advocates on this issue, which we'll get to in just a second. Yeah, actually, let's get you ready. Oh yeah, sorry. So my name is Gabe Murnoff. I'm one of the Gabe, G-A-B-E, and I'm one of the organizers in the Coalition for University Accountability. I'll also explain a little bit more about my background. I'll be one of the speakers as well. Yes, without further ado, let's get going. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, State Representative David Morales, who is the House sponsor of two pieces of legislation that he will talk more about in a second. Yeah.
Thank you all again for taking the time to join us. First and foremost, I'm honored to be advocating alongside this broad coalition of community leaders, local officials, university students, and grassroots community organizations as it relates to collectively demanding accountability from the private institutions across our state, private universities across Rhode Island, specifically those who are hosted here in our Providence community, the capital of Rhode Island. So for decades, Brown University and other wealthy private universities have taken advantage of our community by continuously expanding their tax-exempt footprint, which in turn has led to gentrification, the displacement of working people, and most of all, forcing Providence to manage essential city services such as basic sidewalk and road repairs with a limited tax base that continues to be deteriorated and depleted from. So while Providence has increased the property tax burden on working families in order to ensure that we have the money necessary to invest in these basic services, the endowments of Brown University, RISD, and other tax-exempt universities has continued to grow at unprecedented levels, even throughout the COVID-19 pandemic when many working people were suffering as it relates to economic despair. Just last fall, Brown University celebrated their record-breaking endowment of $6.9 billion. That is billion with a B. Meanwhile, our Providence public schools remain underfunded, lack mental health resources, and our facilities are left crumbling until we rally voters to pass the next capital improvement bond. So seeing as 40% of our city's land is exempt from taxation, largely due to the expansion of private institutions, combined with the displacement of working people, further combined with the growing revenue of private universities, we are at a crossroads. We are at a crossroads where legislative accountability is necessary and long overdue. And that is why we are here today, because together we have developed two approaches to hold large institutions accountable to the communities that they are in. Because we're going to require that they pay their fair share and invest in the communities they're hosted in, the same way working people do, and the same way that our small businesses have done. So the first piece of legislation is House Bill 7956, which will allow cities and towns to essentially end their payment in lieu of taxes pilot agreements, and instead allow them to tax all of the property owned by private universities. And to give you an idea of how effective this policy would be specifically here in Providence, Brown University would go from paying $13 million in pilot payments to annual property tax payments of $49 million. And this makes sense given that they own property worth well over $1.3 billion. Again, billion with a B. For example, just look at the $2.24 million home of the Brown University president. If such a home was taxed like a normal residence, This property alone would generate over $40,000 for our city on an annual basis. Similarly, Providence College, RISD, and Johnson & Wales will be contributing more to our property tax base than they are under our current pilot agreement. As a result, our city would be generating roughly $88 million a year in additional property taxes, which would allow us to ease the burden on working families and make sure that we have the resources and revenue necessary to invest back into the basic services that our residents deserve. Now the second bill, House Bill 7813, would allow cities and towns to oppose up to a 2% tax on a private institution's endowment, with such generated revenue being strictly reserved to the municipality's public school district. As previously stated, endowments of private institutions across the country have been growing. As Brown University now boasts a $6.9 billion endowment, RISD has one worth over $340 million, PC has an endowment of over $290 million, and JWU has an endowment of over $230 million. So if we were to apply even just a 1.5 endowment tax, our Providence public schools would be receiving an additional $116 million annually. Funding, which is much, much needed. So all that said, we are sending a clear message to every private university worth hundreds of millions of dollars that the feel-good philanthropy and charitable giving does not make up for the gentrification, for the displacement, and the lost tax revenue that have hurt working people for decades. Now is the time that we finally establish standards of accountability and require fair investments towards our communities. So for that, I want to thank you all for joining this movement and being a part of these historic bills. Before I close, I would also like to acknowledge some of the Providence City Council candidates we have before us, such as Corey Jones and Miguel Sanchez, who, from my understanding, are in support of such bills alongside mayoral candidate Gonzalo Cuervo. Because this is the reassurance that candidates who are running for office to represent our local cities and towns understand the responsibilities that these private institutions owe to our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Morales. So I'm going to call up our next speaker, State Senator Tiara Mack, who is the sponsor of one of these pieces of legislation.
Hey y'all, I am sponsoring Senate Bill 2600 on the Senate side, which would reduce the tax burden by limiting the tax exceptions imposed on private universities in our communities, specifically Providence. So thank you, Rep. Morales, for giving us those outstanding numbers. The burden of our tax-exempt universities is very clear when we put in perspective that 1% to 2% of a tax on the endowment will help fund our public schools. These are not just feel-good pieces of legislation, they are common sense, data-backed pieces of legislation that will improve the aspects and lives of every single member of our community in Rhode Island. Our Rhode Island nonprofit institutions, our colleges, universities, and hospitals are cherished parts of our communities. They contribute a great deal to our communities. They are part of the fabric of Rhode Island as we know it, and these institutions draw people like myself from all over the globe, some of the brightest thinkers, some of the most creative figures who are now important leaders inside of our state. And like me, and many of the folks who are drawn to our world-renowned universities, Brown University, RISD, JWU, PC, who also just made national headlines for the NCAA in the Sweet 16, I don't really know basketball, but they made it somewhere. They are really important, but the obligation-based community that these universities have to our community is great. This includes supporting the fiscal health of all of our municipalities and the vital services that they provide. Over the many decades, many of the largest nonprofit institutions in our state, especially those in higher education and healthcare, have grown beyond their original scope. The amount of property involved has expanded far past what state leaders would envision at the time these exemptions were put into law. In Providence, nearly 40% of all parcels are owned by these institutions. Nearly half of our city is owned by these tax-exempt institutions. These holdings have grown over the years to include a number of for-profit operations. These include parking garages, restaurants, retail stores, and other uses, as well outside of the core mission of the institutions involved. What we are proposing is legislation that is a cap on the amount of property owned by a nonprofit that can be considered exempt from property taxes. This approach is fair and necessary. This legislation recognizes and rewards the value that our nonprofit institutions bring to our community and to our state, and it's keeping with the original spirit of these exemptions that those institutions were granted. But it also relieves the burden of the unsustainable financial strain municipalities are facing by having 40% of the property in our cities untaxed by these organizations. Considering that roughly 40% of these parcels are tax exempt in Providence, well exceeds the percentage in other New England communities similar to our size. This has resulted in Providence residents being overburdened financially to support the city's operations. At the moment, Rhode Island as a whole is fortunate to have the unprecedented influx of federal infrastructure and stimulus money, along with significant state budget surpluses. Cities and towns have their own federal windfalls, and communities will benefit from the state's current standing. But in the years ahead, that funding is not guaranteed to be there. We need to have creative solutions that are based in facts, that are also recognizing that our universities and our private institutions, including hospitals, have not been putting their fair share for the last decades. We must find new ways of supporting our vital operations and investments to the communities and members of Providence. This includes a wide range of social services that have been chronically underfunded in our communities for decades. Large nonprofit institutions that will be affected by this legislation have enjoyed decades of prosperity here in Rhode Island, and it's time they pass it forward. We are asking them to uplift our communities that they have made their prosperity possible in, and truly give back in the ways that will make a financial impact and relieve the burden for millions of Rhode Islanders, and especially those in Providence. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Senator Mack, for those really powerful words. So our next speaker is Providence Councilman John Goncalves, and so he's going to speak more about this for the city's perspective.
Thank you all for being here. Before I begin, I want to say thank you to the students for educational equity at Brown, housing opportunities for people everywhere also at Brown. I'd like to thank Representative Morales and also co-sponsors at the Senate side, Senator Mack, for their leadership in finding innovative ways to compel large tax-exempt institutions to contribute more to the municipalities that their institutions and students benefit from. My name is John Goncalves, and I represent Fox Point, Wayland, College Hill, the Jewelry District, in downtown and the city of Providence. On the east side and all across the city, people have been impacted by rising property taxes, rising property valuations, while our tax-exempt universities and colleges continue to expand their footprint and continue to take properties off our tax rolls while utilizing city services. Over the last 30 years living in the East Side, I personally witnessed it myself firsthand. Right in Fox Point, for decades and decades, there was a vibrant community of Irish, Portuguese, and Cape Verdean immigrants. The majority of those families, including my own, that lived in the neighborhood for decades, are completely gone. They've been priced out of the neighborhood by college students and as a byproduct of unbounded university expansion. The university I'm referring to is clearly Brown University. And I want to be clear, I'm not here to disparage, pick on, or demonize Brown University. I'm a proud two-time Brown alum. And I spent this past weekend, in fact, on Brown's campus as a proud member of the Brown Alumni Association Board of Governors. So I love Brown. I think we all love Brown. We're all Brown alums. But I also love the city of Providence. We've got a $1.2 billion unfunded pension liability. We've got an education system in disrepair. We've got crumbling infrastructure and basic city services that we can't effectively address because of our financial woes. And as so many of us know, and as Rep. Morales mentioned, if Brown, for example, was not tax exempt, that would generate nearly $49 million to the city coffers every single year. We think about other colleges and universities, Providence College, for example, that's $16.2 million, Johnson & Wales almost $13 million, and that would support our people, improve our quality of life, fix our roads, and alleviate some of the burden that is falling on the residents in the city of Providence. If you think about our district, 02903 and 02906, that accounts for about 40% of the non-owner occupied and owner occupied tax burden in the city. The revenue has to come from somewhere. And while universities contribute to our municipalities in innumerable ways, and we appreciate and acknowledge their local impact, their simultaneous harm is seemingly never quantified. Their challenging impacts on quality of life, their strains and demands on limited city services, their demolition of historic housing stock, their impact on rising rents and property taxes, their displacement and gentrification of neighborhoods like Fox Point. The symbiotic relationship between municipalities and tax-exempt institutions is constantly evolving, and as their endowment values grow, it is critical that they contribute further to their local communities. It's a historic time for us in Providence, where the MOU with universities expires next year. We look forward to increased, I'm going to say this again, increased voluntary contributions to the pilot program, as we've seen historic growths in endowments locally, but also other successful models, including Yale's recent pledge of approximately $135 million to the city of New Haven over a 6-year period. Bottom line, this is sparking the conversation, discourse and dialogue for tangible, sustainable, and financially prudent conversations to support growth in the local economy here in Providence. The question is, will we let university lobbyists win out, or will policymakers have the courage and the political will to alleviate the overwhelming burden that the current taxpayer is experiencing? So we are imploring universities to deepen their commitments to their local municipalities, and these bills can enable us to compel our universities to do their part and pay more of their fair share to, again, alleviate that burden that our taxpayers have been taking on for so long. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gabe. But my hope is that these bills will get fair consideration in committee, and I look forward to continuing to advocate for the taxpayers of the City of Providence and the ongoing discussion in partnership with our universities to build a brighter, more prosperous, and stronger future for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Goncalves, for those wonderful words, and also with your, providing your direct experience with the issue is always really powerful. So I'm going to call the next speaker, Karina Sandoval. So Karina and I, and among many others, work together in the Coalition for University Accountability. But I'll let her introduce herself.
Hello everyone, and I want to thank you all so much for having us here today. And I hope to provide a little bit of student perspective on my trip to background. But before we get started, I do want to take a moment to thank the services built before me on helping draft this legislation and also helping guide the students in our Greater University Sustainability Campaign to the legislation.
That's my cousin.
So, as a bit of an introduction to myself, my name is Karina Sandoval. I'm a junior here at Brown University. And I'm originally from Chicago, actually. I'm not from Rhode Island, but I found an amazing and welcoming community here in Providence through my work with Students for Education Equity, which is the student organization that I co-lead here at Brown. So we're focused primarily on awareness raising, advocacy, and heavily involved with community engagement with local community organizations, and the issue of what Brown pays, or what it does not pay, is something that is not new to us. In fact, when I first came to Brown as a freshman in 2019, really prevalent was the John Hopkins report that was recently released, as well as the Fund for the Education of Children of Providence, which was promised about 14 years earlier at that time. And at that time, it was also unfulfilled. And Brown had intended to establish a permanent $10 million endowment to reckon with its past and ongoing history with the slave trade, and that money would go directly towards Providence Public Schools. So the issue of what Brown pays, I do want to assert that even though Brown technically fulfilled the endowment in 2020, which was 15 years too late, and honestly has always been too late, these small voluntary payments have never been enough. And these small voluntary payments, furthermore, are viewed as a gift. And really, these aren't gifts, these are obligations. These are necessities that Brown owes to the surrounding community around it, and the surrounding community that it was lucky to have a place in. Providence is an amazing, vibrant place that I have rejoiced being welcomed into. But again, these are obligations, and Brown continues to hoard wealth. I do want to emphasize that coming here as a first-generation low-income origin student, coming to Brown was a shock because I'd never known the amount of wealth that could be accumulated on top of College Hill. I often like saying that being at Brown is a process of continuous shock because I have to continuously learn about the amount of wealth that is here, not only amongst the students, but in terms of the institution and the resources that it hoards, only to itself and the students. I'm very lucky to be able to, have its resources at my hands, at my whims, and the students who are standing behind me are also very lucky to have these resources behind us. But they need to be distributed at some point, which is what we have rallied against year after year. And finally, my junior year, this is an opportunity for us to do so, which I really think this legislation and the legislators are bringing this forth. I also want to say that the actions, the good intentioned actions of the students and the faculty are not an excuse for Brown to continue to neglect its role and its obligations to the community. As someone who personally does a lot of community organizing work, community engagement, and community-based research, it really angers me that my actions and my intentions to help the community around me are being used as an excuse for Brown to continue to not pay the community. Because again, it views its placement within the community that it's so lucky to be in as a gift, and not as an obligation. We want to emphasize and we want to assert that Brown owes Providence, not only for its historical role in the slave trade and also through its historical role in continued colonization, but also in its gentrification and its displacement that it continues to engage in, and also through the people that it makes sure to segregate away from these resources that it has. Gabe is going to talk about this more, but in terms of the Providence public school system, we've focused on bringing forth a pipeline to the school, but we really need to be rethinking the concept of the university as a whole. The students are not the only people who should be demanding these, or that the university should be listening to in order to respond to these demands. It's really the entire community behind us, and which is why we're trying to engage in this coalition with all of these legislators, community members, PPSD students, community organizations. But again, these bills are a step forward into ensuring that this is an ongoing commitment to the Providence community. I would like to thank everyone for your time.
Thank you, Karina. Very eloquent as always, yeah, it's just amazing to work with so many great people in this coalition, and we have, our coalition ranges with so many different people and organizations, but it includes a lot of students who we recognize all the benefits that we get from Brown, but also the exploitation that Brown causes. So with that said, I'm going to call up our next speaker, Terry Wright from DARE, Direct Action for Rights and Equality, which is an amazing community-based organization here in Providence. Yeah, Terry and I have worked together a lot of different stuff, and I love Terry. She's amazing, and I can't wait to hear what she has to say.
Thank you. First, I want to say pass, not just give consideration, but pass House Bill 7813 and House Bill 7956. Thank you to State Representative Morales and Senator Mack. Thank you. I have a question. Why is Rhode Island struggling? One word. We've heard it maybe once or twice here today. Accountability. I've been waiting to address this on a much larger platform like the platform here today. Universities in Rhode Island, and specifically Brown University, whose name has been ringing bells from stolen land to displacement in the Black community, indigenous and marginalized. Why are universities allowed to thrive without addressing past, present, and future harms in a state with an overlapping housing crisis, displacement happening at the speed of light through college students in communities that have been hurt the most? Student housing in communities is causing astronomical numbers of homelessness because landlords prefer to partner with universities. There has been a lot of harm done in the Black community, indigenous and marginalized. I say the time is now for reparations. Housing equality, housing justice. It's time for student housing to stop flooding communities, taking up residence of any and all available stock. I also have a message here from the DARE community. Brown, this is for you, Brown. Pay your taxes. That money needs to become revenue in communities that have been hurt the most. Housing is essential to health and the quality of life. A college education does not increase the quality of life. Adequate housing and having a roof over your head and not living in concentrated poverty, having clean drinking water with no lead in the pipes, increases the quality of life. And as we begin to repair the Black community, indigenous and marginalized, because we leave no stones unturned, ask not, this is the Brown again, Brown, ask not what you can do for your students. Ask what you can do for the community. But again, ask not what you can do for your students as your university takes up space and residence in our communities. Ask what you can do for your communities that have suffered harm and oppression by way of Brown University. Pay your taxes, you owe. And it should not have taken a policy to address harm by way of our local colleges and universities. And like the signs say behind me, from slaveholders to tax-free landlords, the struggle continues. Brown's prosperity is built on pain, and we will not become outdone by gentrification again. Time to repair a broken community. Sign the DARE community. Thank you to Brown students hope students. The struggle continues, but joy cometh in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, for those really powerful words. Yeah, that was really amazing. And yeah, you can hear it there that the as Terry said, that this is what the Providence community. I can't think of an organization that is better emblematic of the Providence community than DARE. So if DARE is calling for this, then that's really powerful. So the next speaker is myself, actually. As I said before, I'm Katie Linoff. I'm an organizer with the Coalition for University Accountability, which is the coalition that's organizing around these pieces of legislation. So thank you everyone so much for being here today, as I said. So I'm here today as a graduate of Providence Public Schools, student at Brown University, and as I said, an activist in the Coalition for University Accountability, which includes our organization, Housing Opportunities for People Everywhere, which is a housing justice organization at Brown, and we see this issue as a big issue for housing justice because of the gentrification and displacement, which has been talked about already. So Providence has always been my home. I've known from a young age that our universities and other large nonprofits contribute a huge amount to our city. Jobs, human capital, culture and the arts, among much more. However, there's so much more they can do, as we've talked about today. As a Providence Public Schools grad and education advocate, I know the amazing assets of our school district, but I'm also well aware of its challenges. Providence is a really strong and lively community, but there's so much to be done. PPSD, which is short for Providence Public School District, for people that don't know, although I assume most people do know. PPSD has remarkable students from a diverse array of backgrounds who nevertheless face crumbling school buildings, lead pipes, insufficient resources for teachers, and so many other challenges. At my school, my high school, we didn't even drink from the water fountains because of unsafe conditions and suspicion of intoxication from lead. Roof leaks and disintegrating ceilings on rainy days were routine, and so many kids continue to fall through the cracks of our system year after year, which I first saw firsthand. And all this with some of the world's greatest universities just a stone's throw away. As a student at Brown, I also know the incredible privilege and influence that exists right here, right in our backyard. It's safe to say at Brown that we do not struggle with roof leaks, as I'm sure our fellow Brown students here can attest. Brown gives us access to unimaginably beautiful facilities, to seemingly infinite resources, and has enormous investments that sometimes make it seem more like an enormous hedge fund than an institution of higher learning. As a Providence resident, I've also seen, even in my own lifetime, the way that universities like Brown have transformed the neighborhoods around them, particularly Fox Point and Mount Hope in Providence. Fox Point has been a victim of Brown's expansion and has become the off-campus destination for a majority of Brown upperclassmen, as has already been discussed. This has hurt so many people from the Fox Point community and has contributed to the displacement of a once thriving Cape Verdean community there. And like I said, even in my own lifetime, I've seen a lot of the changes that have happened, although a lot of it happened before I was born as well. I'd like to take this second to highlight the film Some Kind of Funny Puerto Rican by Dr. Claire Andre Watkins, which talks much more about that history, and I suggest everyone check it out. And there's a lot of really amazing historical work done by various heritage societies. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to highlight the activism of so many Fox Point residents, particularly Cape Verdean residents, but also many others, over the past several generations to defend their heritage and their community that long preceded this current coalition. And they've been inspiration for all of us, and we're really happy today to fight alongside many of them today, for justice on this issue. Brown, RISD, Johnson Wales, and all private universities should thrive. But so should Providence, and so should Rhode Island. Currently, the situation cannot be more backwards. Our wealthiest institutions should pay property taxes to Providence just like everyone else. My parents have paid property taxes on our Providence home for 25 years, and so does every other hardworking homeowner in our city and state. We're not singling out our universities and other large nonprofits. To the contrary, we're saying that they're just like everyone else. They benefit from being in our city, so they should pay their fair share. And as some of our best resource entities, they're best positioned to ensure that the next generation of PPSD students has drinkable water, to ensure that Rhode Islanders experiencing homelessness have a place to stay at night, and to ensure that all of our residents live in a city and state not perpetually stuck in debt. We need equity now, and we need tax equity now. Thanks so much. Okay, so I was the last speaker, pretend that was someone else. But okay, I guess David wants to say something.
Yeah. No, I just want to thank everyone again for taking the time to have joined us. We will now be taking any questions from the press. However, before we do, I also want to acknowledge Providence School Board member and Providence Public School alumni, Tyrell Stevens, for being here, because from all levels of government, City Council, School Board, State Legislature, we are all in firm agreement as a coalition of ground elected officials and, as stated before, candidates for public office as well. Now, we believe our private colleges and universities have a responsibility to our city. So with that, I will answer any questions.
Yeah. What do you think the possibility is that these institutions might leave the city as a result of these successes?
Yes, so anytime there is a quote-unquote idea that an institution, a business, company, etc. will be taxed, and they always like to lead with the fear-mongering rhetoric that they will leave. Higher education institutions, however, do not necessarily have that privilege. Even though they're already stationed here, they have their campuses here, and they already have established relationships and partnerships. So I would not buy it for a second if either RISD, Brown University, PC, or JU threatened to essentially leave Providence, given all of their investments over the last several decades.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, why didn't you include hospitals or other large nonprofits in this legislation?
Given the impact of COVID-19 and the effect it has had primarily on our healthcare system as it relates to hospitals and other nonprofits, we do not believe it was the time to necessarily ask for their sense of accountability, given that they are struggling. Whereas on the other hand, we have higher education institutions that have actually seen, again, their endowments grow and also seen their property expand. Brown University, for example, has just expanded out into the jewelry district for the last 2 years and has plans to continue expanding. Whereas our hospitals are staying put and continue to provide the care that our residents need.
Have you seen this type of legislation work in other states or cities at this point?
So other states and cities have also proposed legislation such as this one, the most famous one being the Tax Yield campaign. And they have passed. However, they've been challenged in court. So in terms of like their actual impact, we have not seen it fully implemented.
The bills are permissive. They say the municipality may tax the institutions. Does that leave the door open to renegotiating or essentially pilot agreements? Let them talk with the colleges and universities to provide something.
Yes, so I do want to be clear, these pieces of legislation are both enabling. Therefore, it gives the cities and towns the opportunity to pursue this form of taxation, whether it is for the endowment or for the property. In terms of it turning into a second version of pilot agreements, that is unfortunately a possibility. After all, we have said before, when it comes to the endowment tax, cities and towns can pursue up to a 2% endowment tax, so they have the option of being 1%, 1.5%, 2%, or anything below that. However, given the grassroots presence that you are seeing here, given the shift in government, we are going to hold our local city councils and our mayor accountable if and when this legislation passes to ensure that we are maximizing the revenue necessary for our cities.
And also the figures that you had in the release here, you talked about around 6.9, we generate 49 million, Providence College will propose 16.2. Is this based on 1.5% or 2% of your?
So you are referring to the property taxes. So the property taxes as follows is Brown University under the hospital that would allow for property taxes would owe $49 million, PC would owe $16.2 million, JU would be roughly $12.5 million, and RISD would be $11 million, and that's based on the latest property valuations. In terms of the breakdowns for the endowments, I have that information available as
So
well.
as far as the property taxes go, does that incorporate all university properties, or simply that which is for commercial use and not for education?
It would be for all properties, because we are going to run into a gray area between what is mission-driven and what is not mission-driven. And I do not want the city of Providence or any other city or town in that matter to start entering legal fights as to what is mission versus non-mission. If they own the property, they should be accountable just like any other property owner.
What about if they have satellite offices as well? So say Brown, if they have an office elsewhere, and they can tax them,
A lot of town, property out of town.
including their endowment tax.
Yes, that's correct. So that would be subjected to the respective city or town where they are located within that satellite campus.
And the 2%, sorry, the 2% on endowment, some universities are saying that's tied to donor funds, and they're saying that it might cause a negative impact on fundraising. What would you say to that?
I would say that is nothing compared to the negative impact that their expansion, continued expansion of those taxes on property has had on our communities.
We have a good number of co-sponsors.
Yes, we do. So we have bipartisan support as it relates to the endowment taxes. Minority Leader Blake Filippi from the Republican Party has also co-sponsored this legislation and was very influential in terms of drafting it to ensure that any revenue that we generate from the endowment tax goes specifically to our public school district. Because oftentimes, you will hear some of these private higher education institutions say, we cannot possibly pay taxes to the city as irresponsible as Providence. They do not know how to manage their money. So we're now putting them in a position where if we are to generate these revenues, we're going to ensure it goes directly back to our students, goes back to our youth, and is being invested back into our community.
I would say that sounds a little odd because I pay taxes and I'm not able to direct where it goes. So getting university that seems like an extra item.
That is correct. And again, very much focused on the basic of fairness. And I know we have a question from Rhode Island College.
Hi, Rep. Morales. I have a question about the charter for Brown because the charter dates back to before this country's founding. We've talked a little bit about this on Ray-ality TV and as well as Senator Bell, who's also co-sponsoring it. How will the charter that Brown University has play into this? Is that going to be a barrier to the bills from becoming law?
So this can possibly set up a situation where if we were to pass the property tax bill as relates to House Bill 7956, looking at Brown University's charter agreement going back to the day of King George, it could possibly set us up for a situation in court. And again, there is not necessarily a precedent for how that would be turned, but again, that does not necessarily apply to the three other institutions as it relates to JLU, RISD, and PC, given that Brown is the one with the privilege of having that charter exemption in the first place.
Just a quick follow-up because it sounds like now that the ball, is it fair to say that for these bills the ball is metaphorically in the court of leadership to let these bills go to the floor? Because it sounds like it has bipartisan support.
That is bipartisan support and that support from the vast majority of members of the Providence delegation where these bills will be most impactful and influential. In terms of the conversations with leadership, those are ongoing because as we know, we have the quote-unquote stakeholders in the form of university lobbyists who are going to fight this tooth and nail and ensure that it does not pass.
As for those colleges, universities that are outside of the city of Providence, also apply.
Yes, most notably Roger Williams University out in Bristol. From my understanding in my conversations with Bristol colleagues, they believe they have a fair pilot agreement with Roger Williams University. So again, it's enabling legislation, so it'll be up to the town of Bristol whether or not they do want to pursue this taxation. Very similar as well. It'll be up to the respective cities and towns whether they want to pursue it. But again, Providence is the capital of our state. It is the urban core. It is where we have high levels of poverty. This is a policy where, again, if we are to pass both pieces of legislation, it's going to be primarily focused on ensuring that our city is in a position to finally thrive. So with that, I want to thank you all again for joining us, and I will be available alongside my fellow colleagues in government for any follow-up questions if there are any. Thank you.